Part 4 of X, page 8, chapter 2, Roots. Dear Aunt Dolly, Grandma wants a book written which tells what Grandpa Gordon Kahl was really like. She needs some background on the Kahl clan. As his sister, you are the best source. How about it? Love, Little Dolly. Dear Little Dolly, our paternal ancestors came to the United States from Germany in the late 1830s. According to one version of the story, the younger members of a titled family left Europe because they wanted to get away from the endless wars and hoped to settle in a land where they could live without fighting. Ironically, there were 4 cousins who fought in the war between the states, 2 for the Union and 2 for the Confederacy. Part of the first families who came to America settled in southern Wisconsin, and the others went to Missouri near St. Louis. Our grandfather, Henry Kahl, was born near Mount Horeb, Wisconsin in the 1840s. According to his tombstone in the Heaton Cemetery, he was the oldest of 3 children, Henry, Sophia, and Jacob. Jacob married Mary Heischer. They lived on a farm near Mount Horeb, Wisconsin, west of Madison. This family consisted of 9 children, all girls. Grandpa's sister married a Norwegian named Newman. They moved to Emrado, North Dakota, near Grand Forks. Aunt Sophie's son, John Newman, was best man for Mother's and Dad's wedding in 1917. Our Aunt Nina used to correspond with some of the Wisconsin cousins, but Mother and Dad only kept in touch with Uncle John and Aunt Mary. Mary had a little brother, August, and a sister, Elizabeth, Lizzie. They lived at home and inherited the family fortune when the parents died. I had the impression that they were quite comfortable when most North Dakota farmers were poor during the Depression years. After the death of his first wife, John Newman married Lizzie, her sister. They visited North Dakota annually for many years. In the fall of 1936 or 1937, Lizzie's brother, August Heischer, bought a new car and brought his family for a visit. The women wore beautiful fur coats, and each had her hair colored. I was really impressed. They spoke with a real thick German accent. Someone said they spoke German in their homes. Our grandfather, Henry Kahl, was married very young and had 6 children: Will, Henry, George, John, Bermelou, and Joan. I believe his first wife died when Joan was born. His second wife had tuberculosis and only lived a short time. Grandpa must have been in his 40s when he married our grandmother, Minnie DeCoe. She was only 17. This was in Pipestone, Minnesota. Our paternal grandmother was born in Berlin, Germany, about 1867. Her father, Fred DeCoe, was Alsatian German. And her mother, whose family name was Marquette, was French. I believe both of Grandma Kahl's parents are buried in the Pipestone Cemetery. The DeCoe family must have come to the U.S. in the late 1870s. Grandma had an older brother who immigrated first and reportedly found gold in the Black Hills. He convinced his father, who was a successful saloon keeper in Berlin, that America was the land of the great opportunity. Grandma also had a younger brother, Herman. Soon after the family arrived in Minnesota, the older brother's trunk arrived from the Black Hills. The brother never came, nor was he ever heard from again. The family was concerned that he was killed for his gold. The younger brother, Herman, returned to Germany when he was grown and was not heard from after the war began in 1914. They assumed he died in the war. Our grandparents, Henry and Minnie Kahl, lived on their farm near Pipestone, Minnesota, during the early years of their marriage, with Minnie helping rear her younger stepchildren. Later, they moved to a farm near Brookings, South Dakota. Our father Fred was born in Minnesota, the oldest child. His sisters and brothers who followed in order were Anna, Ed, Edith, Herb, Laura, Nina, Charles, and Arthur. Dad was almost 21 years older than Arthur, Artie. I believe it was while the Kahls were still living in Minnesota that Grandpa invented a sweet milk butter churn. Prior to this, it was necessary to skim the cream from the top of the whole milk and then let the cream sour before it could be churned into butter. After planning his churn, Grandpa Kahl carved all the parts from hardwood and then put them together into a working model and obtained his patent. Unfortunately, Lee Laval had patented the cream separator, and his working models were already in the stores for marketing. The separator enabled the farmer to separate the cream from the whole milk, resulting in 3 byproducts: cream, butter, churned from the cream, and skim milk. Whereas Grandpa's sweet milk churn only gave them butter and sweet buttermilk. Our father, Fred, seemed to have grown up quickly. He was large for his age and followed along after his older half-brothers to parties and community affairs when he was still very young. As a young man, Dad had a lot of stomach trouble. The family doctor finally suggested that maybe a change of climate would help. Dad took the train to a German community near Moscow, Idaho. He worked for a farm family there for several years, although he still had the same health problems. Finally, a country doctor diagnosed the condition as chronic appendicitis. After surgery, there was an immediate improvement. While Dad was working in Idaho, he and 3 friends took out 3 claims near Lake Coeur d'Alene. But Dad never went back to prove up on his claim. It was while our father Fred was in Idaho that Grandpa Kahl decided to move to North Dakota. In South Dakota, the Kahls had a large herd of milk cows, and most of their grain farming was for feed for the cattle and horses. They had several hired men the year around to help with the work. Grandpa heard the stories about the wonderful wheat farms in North Dakota and how much easier and more profitable wheat farming was than cattle farming. So he sold his South Dakota farm and came north. He bought the 2 quarters of land that became the Kahl family farm and moved the family and all their belongings. He paid cash for the land and built the barn and granary that are still there. This must have been 1906 or 1907. They planned to build a new house the following year for the next 2 years. They lost their entire grain crop from hail, so the new house was not built until 1951. The same house Richard Blay and his army destroyed on February the 15th, 1983. Our dad returned to North Dakota in 1910 and helped his family with the farming. Grandpa Kahl's health was failing and he needed someone to be in charge. Dad did very well at it, even though he had trouble keeping his mind off one beautiful girl he had met in church. She was the apple of his eye, and the feeling soon became mutual. She set her hat for him, as the saying goes. Dad and Mother began dating in 1910 and continued their courtship until their marriage, January 4th, 1917. When the consolidated school was built in Heaton, the 4 country schools it replaced were closed. One of the schools was in the southeast corner of our home place. Grandpa Kahl bought the building and the grounds from the school district and made a house out of the school for Grandma and himself and the younger children who were still at home. Mother and Dad moved into the old house, where each of the children of our family were born. Grandpa Kahl's health continued to decline. Finally, when his skin turned yellow, the doctors decided he must have cancer that had spread to his liver. He was operated on in the University of Minnesota Hospital, but did not survive. He died on November the 4th, 1917. Our maternal ancestors came from Germany, Ireland, and England in the late 1700s. Laudenslagers, Flars, Webbs, and Millers. Grandma Laudenslager parents, the Alexander Millers, were from Philadelphia's area, but moved to Missouri, where Grandma Rose Miller was born around 1792. The family later moved to Defiance, Iowa, where Grandma Laudenschlager finished high school. Grandma Laudenschlager parents were John Laudenschlager and Helen Flower. Helen's father had a general store in Beaver Creek, Maryland, just south of Hagerstown, and he also owned some land to the west. The Flowers must have been a large, closely knit family, and I believe they were Southern sympathizers during the Civil War. The Union Army marched through and completely destroyed everything in the store. Grandpa Laudenschlager was born in Beaver Creek in 1861. After the war, his grandfather, Flower, traded his acreage in western Maryland for 80-acre parcels of land in Iowa, one for each of his children and one for himself. The entire family moved west. In Grandpa Laudenschlager's immediate family, there were 5 boys and 2 girls. In Grandma Laudenschlager's family, there were 4 girls and 1 boy. Mary, Grandma Rose, then Della, Clara, and Gary. As a young man, Grandpa Laudenschlager and his brothers, John and Shelby, rode horseback through the frontier settlements of Nebraska, Kansas, and Indian Territory, which later became Oklahoma. I believe they were there when the territory was opened up for settlement. Grandpa told about him and his brothers riding along a trail and being approached by 2 other riders, who asked the Laudenschlagers who they were and where they were going. They all rode together for a while, and then the 2 left the trail. Grandpa said that they thought their companions were Frank and Jesse James. The Posse Comitatus shot and wounded these 2, killed 3 others, and wounded and captured 3 of the youngers southeast of Fargo, North Dakota, when the gang attempted to rob the Northfield Bank. Nowadays, people think bankers rob the farmers instead of vice versa. Grandpa and Grandma Laudenschlager were married in Defiance, Iowa on Christmas Day in 1890. I think Mother Edna was born in 1892, Paul Ned in 1894, Hazel in 1896. None of the children had middle names because Grandma said, with a last name like Laudenschlager, who needs a middle name? There was a sister, Elsie, who must have been a new baby when the whole Laudenschlager family came to North Dakota by covered wagon in 1898. The William Flowers were already living on their farm west of Heaton. The Laudenschlagers lived in a granary of the Flowers until the grandpa got his cabin built on his homestead south of Heaton. It was a hard summer. They broke up sod for a garden and a little feed grain, but without a drop of rain all summer long, nothing grew. There were some well-to-do ranchers whose cattle fed off the open ranges. Naturally, these people tried hard to discourage the homesteaders from coming in and fencing off the land. Both the Hardings to the west and St. Jacques to the northeast told horror stories about people freezing and starving to death during the terrible, severe winter. By the end of August, without any hope of either vegetables or livestock feed, the Laudenschlagers hooked up their covered wagons and started back for Iowa. It took 3 weeks. Baby Elsie became ill and died soon after they reached Defiance. The rains came to North Dakota soon after they left, and the seeds that had been planted grew into vegetables and feed. So the following spring, Grandpa, Grandma, and their 3 children returned to North Dakota by train. There were many hard times during those early days, but everyone worked hard together. Grandma Laudenschlager taught in the nearby country school for a year or 2. Then another child, Lillian, arrived in 1902, and she didn't return to teaching after that. In 1912, Mother took the state teacher's examination for certification and began teaching the country school in southwestern Spacewell District. After teaching there for 3 years, she took special methods courses during the summer sessions in Valley City State Teachers College and at the University of North Dakota. She also taught at Herdsfield and Cathay before getting married in 1917. Gordon was born on January the 8th, 1920, after a very difficult pregnancy for Mother. He was really precious, the first Laudenschlager grandchild and a boy. Besides that, he was a really beautiful baby. Aunt Hazel stayed with the folks for the first 3 months after he was born because of Mother's poor health. Mother said she and Hazel would sit and watch Gordon sleep and admire him. There were many relatives nearby who liked children, so Gordon received a lot of attention. It must have been a bit of a blow for him to have to share his beautiful world when I arrived 3 years later, February 12th, 1923. My name is Dolores, but he called me Dolly. I think he had a nickname for everyone. Our brother Clarence was born in 1928, Lorene, Rena, in 1930, and Elva June in 1932. 1928 was a bad year in many ways. Dad had a good wheat crop, but before he got it harvested and threshed and sold, the price had dropped from $1.05 a bushel to 25 cents. The Great Depression hit North Dakota farmers before it hit Wall Street in 1929. The drought of the early 30s and the terrible dust storms are vivid memories of us Kahl children. I can remember Mother being in the garden watching big black clouds come up in the west. While we were hoping so much for rain, a few sprinkles and a lot of thunder, lightning and wind maybe, would be all we received. Nevertheless, we always had plenty to eat and a warm, comfortable home thanks to Mother's good housekeeping efforts. Dad took good care of his animals and always butchered the best of the beef, pork, chickens, and turkeys to eat. We sold only the cream and eggs that we didn't need for food. Dad was an intellectual who truly enjoyed farming. He was a perfectionist who always looked for quality when he bought something. Each season, he would overhaul the machinery so that it was in mint condition before he went into the field to work. By being selective, Dad developed a variety of Cinnabon Indian corn that would mature earlier and produce a fairly large ear of corn. At one time, he sold some of his seeds to the Mill Seed Company in Bismarck. It must have been in the spring of 1928 when Dr. Westervelt examined Dad and told him that he would have to quit farming because his blood pressure was so high. Instead of quitting, Dad sold his horses and bought a tractor. He remodeled his horse machinery so it could be used with the tractor. It wasn't long until Gordon began driving the tractor in the field. In 1919, Mother and Dad bought their first car, a new Buick, I think. They must have had a lot of fun. Dad's family had always had spirited driving horses, and he was in the habit of passing everyone on the road. Having the new car made it even more challenging, even when the road was narrow and Dad had to use the ditch to pass. At this time, our folks were renting the pasture land east of us. Mother learned to drive the car by taking the cows to the pasture. Gordon must have been about 6 years old when he began driving the Buick. He would drive down to the house from the granary real fast, then stop quickly, jump out, and look behind to see how much dust he had kicked up. Both the Kahls and the Laudenschlagers were interested in hunting. During those early years, the plentiful game provided the only meat for the table many times for the Laudenschlagers. I don't remember when Dad bought Gordon his first rifle, but I'm quite sure it was the fall of 1930. When he got Gordon his first shotgun, a 16 gauge. Dad got himself a 12 gauge, and the two of them hunted together. These two family heirlooms were part of the dangerous weapon cache that the FBI confiscated. In the mid-30s, the hunters from Heaton usually invited Gordon to go hunting with them in the hills between Heaton and Pettibone. Gordon was such a good shot that he made a major contribution to their bag limit. In those years, the state paid a bounty on gopher tails, sometimes 2 cents, and in the winter, rabbit pelts brought 5 cents. I believe the gophers were a real nuisance to the farmers, especially in the cornfields. It was quite a challenge to earn enough to pay for the ammunition and have some left over. Gordon could not afford to miss. Gordon hunted the year around. Gophers, crows, hawks in the spring and summer, prairie chickens, grouse, pheasants, and ducks in the fall, and rabbits in the winter. There were no deer in our part of North Dakota at that time. The game Gordon provided in the fall enabled us to have a lot of delicious meals before it was time to butcher pork and beef. Gordon was always good about helping to prepare the meat for cooking. Our mother was very ill while she was pregnant with Elva. Toward the end, she developed a blood clot in one of her legs and needed to stay off her feet. Gordon, age 12, was wonderful help to her at the time. We had a Maytag washing machine, gasoline motor, wringer type. Gordon took care of the washing the clothes that spring. As I recall, he would not hesitate to stay home from school when he was needed. On June 19, 1932, a Sunday morning when I was 9, Mother's labor pains began. Gordon and I bundled up Clarence and Rena and got in the Buick and went into town to get Miss Brown, who was the midwife. Gordon asked someone to call Dr. Westervelt to come out to the farm. We left Miss Brown at our place and then went on down to spend the rest of the day with Grandpa and Grandma Laudenschlager, who were truly the big kids looking after the little kids. We were truly the big kids looking after the little kids. The saddest event in our early lives was the death of our sister, Rena, on December the 22nd, 1937. She took sick during the night, and by the following afternoon when she was operated on, her appendix had ruptured and peritonitis had spread throughout her body. She was buried on Christmas Eve. Miss Lillian Turner, the wife of the banker in Heaton, was also an accomplished pianist. She felt responsibility to see to it that each child in the community had the opportunity to study music and to learn to play the piano. Gordon and I both took lessons for many years. Gordon was really talented, but couldn't resist playing popular music by ear instead of practicing the classical pieces. I guess Mother got tired of fussing at him, and he quit taking the lessons in the early 30s. When he was in high school, he played the piano for a little dance band from Bowden, which performed for community dances. While Gordon was in high school, he always took care of the special lighting effects for our school plays and programs. He seemed to have a special talent for electricity. It must have been in the middle 30s when Gordon, 15, carved a big propeller from wood to put on the house and let the wind generate current for electricity. He installed the lights and batteries, and we had our own electric light system. All right, I'm going to stop there at the top of page 17 since we're about 22 minutes, and we'll resume the next part at the top of page 17. All right, I looked ahead in the chapter. It's only a few more pages, so we're going to go ahead and finish off the chapter. He installed the lights and batteries, and we had our own electric light system. During the war, Gordon sent Dad's plans to wire the old tractor, installing a generator and battery. This gave the tractor lights and made it possible to work nights when necessary. Gordon was talented intellectually as well as in music and art. It was hard for him to discipline himself to do schoolwork, which he considered unnecessary. Thus, he often got lower grades in some courses because he refused to turn in written assignments, even though he always scored high on the final exams, which at Heaton were state exams. Gordon graduated from high school in 1938. That winter, he joined the CCC and spent 6 months or so in eastern Montana. In the fall of '39, Gordon, together with Mel, Clint, and Deline Anderson, worked the fruit orchards from Washington to California and then spent the winter in Arizona. The older boys then worked in the mines there, but Gordon couldn't because he was under 21. Gordon began helping out in the Heaton hardware store in the spring of 1941. He tried to enlist in the armed forces that fall, but was rejected because his broken nose caused breathing problems. When Gordon was 3 or 4, he was visiting Grandpa and Grandma Laudenschlager while the men were working in Grandpa's new barn. Gordon was running back and forth and ran into a board that had just been put in place and hurt himself badly. His nose swelled and was infected, but the doctor didn't realize it was broken because nobody mentioned the accident until after it was all healed up. When it finally healed and the swelling went down, it was easy to see the break. The doctor thought it would be too painful to break it again and reset it perfectly. After Pearl Harbor, Gordon went to the county draft board and asked that his name be pulled. This time, he was accepted in the Army Air Corps. He was assigned to pilot training, but when he found out how long it would take to get his wings, he volunteered for gunnery school. In January 1944, Dad was coming home from town with a wagon full of coal. The ground was frozen and there were deep ruts. Just as he was coming through the lane, the horses jerked. Dad lost his footing and fell headfirst into the frozen ground. Several vertebrae were crushed, but the spinal cord was not pinched, and the doctor only put on a neck brace. He did not stop work. In early June, he suffered a severe stroke which paralyzed his entire left side. Dad never gave up. As soon as he got out of the hospital, he began working with his hand and arm, finally regaining use of them. He worked with a cane at first, and later just by dragging his left leg. He never regained the use of his left leg. But he drove the tractor, did field work, and took care of the livestock. He planned, and with the help of Gordon and Clarence, built the new house without any outside help. I was home in January of 1951 when Mother and Dad were working on their 1950 income tax returns. I remember Mother complaining because they had to pay more than $1,000 in taxes at their ages. Dad said, "Let's be thankful we have the money with which to pay the taxes. Think of all those Depression years when we didn't have $1,000 in income." Our grandfather, Henry Kahl, was a devout Lutheran. One of the neighbors who knew Grandpa well told me that he never sat down to eat without bowing his head and thanking God for the food. Dad used to tell about an incident where they were still living in Minnesota, and Eddie and Edie were small. The men were stacking hay and the children were playing on top of a completed stack. Suddenly a prairie fire came sweeping toward them with the wind blowing the flames directly toward the stack. When it seemed that there was no way they could rescue the children, Grandpa asked all the men to get on their knees, and he led them in prayer. Suddenly, the wind changed direction, and the fire stopped, just in time to save the children. All through the 30s, Mother and we children attended the Congregational Church and Sunday School in Heaton. Dad was often tired and slow on Sundays, but Gordon was a faithful chauffeur. He enjoyed the Sunday School class for the big boys, as long as Miss Center, the minister's wife, taught the class. After her death, there never was anyone who reached the young people the way she did. Until 1940, Mother's immediate family all lived within 2-mile radius of the homestead. Ned married Elizabeth Ankerruin, and Lillian married Johnny Ankerruin in a double ceremony in November 1923. Hazel married Jack James in April of 1936. There was always a family get-together for each holiday and for each family birthday. Good food was an important part of every celebration. Grandma Laudenschlager always had Christmas dinner with either roast goose or roast turkey, and for dessert there was a homemade mincemeat pie. As soon as the dishes were finished, out came huge platters of homemade candy, chocolate fudge, divinity, caramels, and penuche, as well as popcorn balls and bowls of unshelled mixed nuts. While we were all stuffing ourselves with these goodies, Grandma would cook a batch of taffy, and we would have a taffy pull. Even the little children were permitted to pull taffy. Grandpa Laudenschlager liked to play cards, so everyone interested would gather around the big table and play hearts or some other game where the number of players was unlimited. By 5 o'clock, the card game would have to end so the tables could be used for another meal, sandwiches, fruit jello, pickles, several kinds, and cake. Then if the weather was bad, we would bundle up, get on the stone boat and cover up, heads and all, with fur robes. Our spirited horses would cover the mile or so home in no time. What a wonderful time we had. We often celebrated July 4th at Grandpa Laudenschlager's. They would cut ice in the spring, put it down an old dry well, and cover it with lots of straw. The ice would be frozen by July the 4th, and it would be used to make ice cream by first cooking a custard and then adding measuring cream and milk. She said she couldn't think of eating raw eggs, even if they were frozen in ice cream. Grandpa Laudenschlager suffered several strokes during the 30s. He died in 1940. Grandma Laudenschlager died from cancer in 1944. Dad's family was more widely separated. Charles and Herb married and moved to Cleveland, North Dakota. Annie and her family were living in Jamestown, North Dakota, in the 20s and early 30s. And Eddie lived near Cando, Cando. The rest of the family moved to Oregon in the mid-20s. There are Kahl's cousins in Washington, Oregon, and California. Grandma Kahl used to spend some time each year with each North Dakota family. She was the kindest, best-hearted person one could ever find. In the spring of 1932, she went to Oregon and lived with our Aunt Nina most of the time. She died in 1954. These are some of the facts of our family background to the best of my knowledge. His love and mine, Dolores Kahl Everest. Talking about all that food made me hungry. A teenager must eat, you know. I think I'll get a sandwich and then tell about North Dakota farming in bygone days a bit. All right, that's the bottom of page 20. We'll pick up with the next part at the top of page 21.